For 6 miserable months in my early 20s, I was an auto policy renewal clerk in a large insurance company in downtown Toronto. I was also an avid poetry reader. When I discovered that the American poet Wallace Stevens was the vice president of an insurance company and a poet, I decided he was my guy. I'm not sure I knew at the time what I was getting myself into. Stevens is sometimes described as a willfully difficult poet. His poems, energetic, erudite, and utterly confounding, and decades later I'm still struggling with them. I mentioned as much to renowned Canadian poet Anne Carson in an interview last year. I'm in the middle of trying to understand Wallace Stevens.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's really uphill work. I've been trying to understand Wallace Stevens for years.
It's heavy lifting, isn't it?
It's heavy lifting, but doesn't it make a better day when you do a bit of that?
Actually, it does. After my conversation with Anne Carson aired, I've got a book in the mail called A Reader's Guide to Wallace Stevens. Its author, Eleanor Cook, is Professor Emerita of English at the University of Toronto. She is also the author of Poetry, Wordplay, and Word War in Wallace Stevens, Enigmas and Riddles in Literature, and Elizabeth Bishop at Work. So I've invited her to come in and walk me through 3 of Wallace Stevens' poems, and Eleanor Cook joins me now in our studio in Toronto. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much. Anne Carson is wonderful.
But speaking of enigmatic, the two of them together, I mean, it's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it's true. Although some of her work is pretty accessible, not all of it is, but it's worth sticking with, like Stevens.
Well, okay. Now you raise the question of accessibility. Does poetry have to be accessible?
No.
It doesn't.
It's whatever compels the poet to write, what they have to write about.
What drew you to Wallace Stevens? How did you come in contact?
Because he drove me nuts like you.
Is that right?
Well, I was asked to teach a course in modern poetry, and I had some handle on T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost and Marion Moore. And it started out with the great W.B. Yeats, for my money, the best English language poet of the 20th century. But this Stevens guy, although from the beginning I loved his sense of humor. He has a great sense of humor. Yes.
Where would you place him in the pantheon of poetry? Some said that he is the quintessential American poet of the 20th century.
Oh, that's interesting. He's certainly one of the great moderns. I mean, that group of poets around the turn of the century that changed the way poetry is written, period, amen. You can't write 19th century tum-tum-tum, moon and June stuff anymore. Yeah. And it develops in different directions. Robert Frost carries on with a line from Wordsworth, for example, and he is pretty accessible. There are dangers in being accessible, too. I mean, people read you too simplistically.
Yeah.
But Stevens is one of those. So if you're writing poetry nowadays, you have to take him into account.
You said in the introduction to your book that he wanted to write poetry of the earth, poetry
Yes.
of its place, especially poetry of the natural world.
Yes, yeah. You can call such people nature poets, but nature poetry is a very unhelpful term because nature can be everything. I think this is Frost. Nature can be pretty scenery or else the whole goddamn machinery. You know, X meanings for nature. So
Right.
Poetry of the earth is his term. The great poems of heaven and hell have been written, but the great poem of earth remains to be written.
He spent most of his working life with the Hartford Accident Indemnity Company.
I know. Assurance Company, yes, indeed.
Do you know anything about insurance? Do you know what a surety claim is?
Surety bond is, yes.
You're not supposed to know.
Oh, well, all right, you tell me. But how could I not know? He was said to be the best surety bond man in the country.
He won an award for the best surety bond claim thing in the country.
Did he now?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
I never won anything, by the way, when I was in insurance. Nothing.
A surety bond is what a company who's got a project in mind gets, so that they're guarded against not being sued because they can't do this project properly.
Do you think you missed your calling? You should have gone into the insurance business?
Good Lord, no.
How do you explain the contrast between this simple, mundane life of the insurance company and the enigmas and the ambitions in the poetry?
He actually wrote briefly about the likeness of surety bonds and poetry. He said each case is different, but I don't see any contradiction myself. Chaucer was a highly placed person in the equivalent of the customs department nowadays. Milton, during Oliver Cromwell's time, was Latin secretary, which means Department of Foreign Affairs. William Carlos Williams was a doctor.
Eliot worked in a bank.
Eliot worked in a bank, and he was very good at what he did.
Lloyd's, wasn't it?
Lloyd's.
When you read Stevens, do you read him aloud?
Oh, good question. Well, when I taught him, I certainly read him aloud. I tend not to, but one always wants to hear it in one's head, you know.
Because this is what I've tried to do it, and thinking that maybe some envelope of understanding would open up. And it sounds, I was going to say it sounds better than it reads, but it has great cadence to it.
I know exactly what you mean, yeah. I mean, like any good poet, he has a sense of the poetic line and how to make it, run or jump or crawl along. Or yes, that's essential.
I want to start with a poem that he wrote called Men Made Out of Words.
Ah, yes.
Because it seems to be a poem that he's thinking through what poems are and what stories mean and so on. And I want to just read that, if you would indulge me.
Yes, indeed.
While I do this, it's called Men Made Out of Words by Wallace Stevens. What should we be without the sexual myth, the human reverie or poem of death? Castratos of moon mash, life consists of propositions about life. The human reverie is a solitude in which we compose these propositions, torn by dreams, by the terrible incantations of defeats, and by the fear that defeats and dreams are one. The whole race is a poet that writes down the eccentric propositions of its fate.
Oh, that's very nice.
That's Men Made Out of Words. Now, what is he saying here? He's talking about the role that stories play in our lives, I guess.
The stories we tell ourselves.
Tell me more.
Well, everybody tells themselves a story, whether it's articulated or not, about their own life. They look on their life as taking this sort of shape. And the points that he focuses on, sex, general human reverie, and death, these are crucial points in our lives. How do we regard them? What kind of story do we tell ourselves? That's true of everyone, I think, even though they don't put it that way.
Do we know that we need stories or want stories? And do we get from the poem, is it a prescription, do you think?
No.
No?
It's a description, I would think.
Okay. The human reverie or poem of death, Castratos of moon mash.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, that's interesting. There are a couple of things that occurred to me when I was rereading Stevens for this interview. And I thought to myself, good poetry is like that. It keeps feeding you. And one of the things, quite a minor thing really, is that word moon mash. And I thought, why have I never thought much about this word before? And then I thought, well, it's a variation on mishmash. And so I looked up mishmash, and behold, it's a 15th century word, and it comes from Yiddish, of all things.
Mishmash?
Yes. I know.
So he plays with words then?
Oh, he plays with them all the time.
The beginning of the poem, which he says, what should we be Without the sexual myth, the human reverie or poem of death. The stories, all these stories we tell, they're all about sex and death. Was he death obsessed, do you think, or sex obsessed?
I mean, the question of Eros in Stevens is very interesting. He wrote 2 very good love poems that he collected in Harmonium.
He was not happily married, was he?
He was not, alas. It was a long-distance courtship over about 5 years. She was very beautiful, by the way. It's her profile that's on the American Liberty dime.
There's a line in one of Stevens' later poems, but she that he loved turns cold at his light touch.
That is just... that just makes me shudder. You know, there's a whole novel in that one line.
Yeah. Tell me about the titles of his poetry.
Oh, he had a gift for titles.
One of them is called Poetry is a Destructive Force.
Ah, yes.
I mean, why did he have these strange titles? Emperor of Ice Cream.
Oh, well, the Emperor of Ice Cream. That's fun, isn't it? Yes, that's one.
Peter Quince at the Clavier.
That's a love poem as well.
Who's Peter Quince?
He's in Shakespeare.
Oh, is he?
Yes.
Shows you what I know.
Yeah.
All right, one of the interesting titles, and one I want to talk to you about the poem itself, is 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird.
Yes, indeed.
Now, I'm going to read a few stanzas. I'm not going to read all 13.
Uh-huh.
But I'm fast. You got to help me with this. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Professor, you got to. This is called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. And the last stanza. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs.
Yes.
What the hell is that all about? I'm sorry.
I guess the first thing that occurred to me when I looked at it was 13. That's an unlucky number in English and maybe more generally in the West. It's not unlucky in Japan. And so I said to myself, is this a collection of haiku-like poems? There's not one that is technically a haiku. I tested them.
Okay, but it's not that.
And yet there's no suggestion of bad luck in these. It's provocative.
Is it a poem that you're supposed to understand, or it's just for the sensation of it?
It's exactly that. It's for the sensations. He said in the letters, I meant this to be a series of sensations, not ideas. And so sight and sound. I like some parts better than others.
Do you have a favorite? Does something jump out at you?
The innuendos one. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after.
Now, to me, when I read that, I thought, this guy loves gossip. The poem.
Oh, that sort?
Yes.
Oh, I see, yeah.
That he could be drawn away from the beauty of inflective writing if there was some gossip around.
Well, innuendo has a wider meaning than that. It's a blank that you can fill in. It reminded me of listening to music. It tends to keep repeating itself in your head. And which do you like, the actual experience or what happens afterwards?
I have to point out that you weren't reading that quote. You were saying it from memory.
Yes.
I'm stunned.
Things stick in your head.
Now, his style, Wallace Stevens' style, did it change after Blackbird?
The major change is in the 1930s, after Man with the Blue Guitar. He wrote that he wanted to be quiet and work on perfecting a style. And the next collection that he published is called Ideas of Order. And it's much more bare when you read it, and yet there's a sort of truth-telling in it. And since it's in the 30s, the kinds of order, economic orders, political orders, fascism, communism, so on, the Great Depression, all this is in the background.
My guest this morning is Eleanor Cook. She's Professor Emerita of English at the University of Toronto. She's the author of many books, including A Reader's Guide to Wallace Stevens. It's published by Princeton University Press, and this morning she's with me in our studio in Toronto. A poem that has particular resonance for you, I understand, is The River of Rivers in Connecticut.
Yes, I love it.
Okay, let me struggle through here. Forgive me of my reading, because it's obviously impoverished, but hang on a second. It's The River of Rivers in Connecticut. There is a great river this side of Stygia before one comes to the first black cataracts and trees that lack the intelligence of trees. In that river, far this side of Stygia, the mere flowing of the water is a gaiety, flashing and flashing in the sun. On its banks, no shadow walks. The river is fateful, like the last one, but there is no ferryman. He could not bend against its propelling force. It is not to be seen beneath the appearances that tell of it. The steeple at Farmington stands glistening, and Haddam shines and sways. It is the third commonness with light and air, a curriculum, a vigor, a local abstraction. Call it once more a river, an unnamed, flowing, space-filled, reflecting the seasons, the folklore of each of the senses. Call it again and again, the river that flows nowhere, like a sea. Why is that such an important poem for you?
Because it's a poem of life. I'll tell you something. I gave a paper a few years back at a conference, and I was reading from this poem. I thought to myself, I'm going to have to stop because I don't know if I can get through it without bursting into tears. It's written by a man, 1953, so he's hit by this time 70, he's over 70. And it's such an assertion of life because, of course, the contrast is between the Connecticut River, a river of life, and the river of death, because the Styx, as you know, is
with a ferryman.
On its banks no shadow walks, and shadow as in the shades of the dead that walk along.
Or Stygian darkness.
Yes, exactly, yes. I guess it's perhaps the pulse of that poem that does it. And then the river that flows nowhere, like a sea, is the bloodstream.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, I mean, round and round and round, yeah.
You have to, we're almost out of time, but
yes,
you talk about Wallace Stevens, and I envy you for this, almost as a friend.
Well...
Or somebody that you know very well and are comfortable in his company.
Yes. I think that happens when you spend time with most poets anyway. Ezra Pound, the wretched Ezra Pound, I have no desire to spend time in company of. But otherwise, even Eliot, who's prickly and so on, you think to yourself, yes, he might have been fun.
Would you want to live in a world that didn't have poetry?
Good Lord, no. But I can't imagine such a world.
It is a delight to meet you on the radio. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Eleanor Cook is Professor Emerita of English at the University of Toronto. She is the author of many books, including A Reader's Guide to Wallace Stevens, which I recommend if you're struggling with Wallace Stevens, as I continue to do. It's a terrific book. This morning she was with me in our studio in Toronto. You're listening to the Sunday edition across Canada on CBC Radio 1 and across North America on Sirius XM Radio Channel 169. My name is Michael Enright.